you so much for joining us here at The Research Her, the show working to improve the health disparities for women of color, one topic at a time. I am Alicia. I'm here learning and growing with you as we research our way to well-being. Dr. Ijeoma Kola is a historian of public health, an entrepreneur, and a lifestyle blogger. She holds a PhD in social medical sciences from Columbia University, where she studied the cultural and intellectual history of asthma in African Americans. A blogging veteran, Dr. Kola has been creating beauty, style, travel, and lifestyle content to inspire women of color for 10 years. She has produced visually appealing and conversation starting digital content for companies such as Uber, Sephora, Away, and Michael Kors. She recently launched Cohort Sisters, an online support network for Black women at all stages of their doctoral degree process. Born in Nigeria and raised in New Jersey, she currently lives in Nairobi, Kenya with her husband and baby. And now it's time for this awesome conversation with Dr. Ijeoma Kola. So I like to start off the interview with icebreaker questions. So are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what does an exciting day look like for you?
Ooh, okay. So an exciting day for me looks like a day, I'm such like a grandma, a day of me sitting on the couch and watching Queer Eye and ordering pizza. That's like the most fun thing that I can do right now. So a day of relaxation and not having to look at my computer. That's a very exciting day.
Yeah, that sounds so beautiful. If you had to eat one thing every day for the rest of your life, what would it be?
I would probably eat white rice and stew and plantains every day. So it's a traditional Nigerian dish. I'm Nigerian, and it's just like, it's my favorite food. It's just comfort food. So yeah, I would probably eat that every day if I had to.
Nice. And the last question is, if you could break the law one time, what would you do?
So right now, I would actually see my family somehow. I would get on a plane. I'd take the baby and my husband, I guess. I would need to see my family. That's the one law that I would break right now. I'm sure like a year from now, the law I would want to break would be totally different. But right now, the most important thing that I would love to do, if I had enough money to pay someone to do it, I would, to go see my family.
Okay. And just for those who may be listening a little bit later, we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. So that's why like travel out of the U.S. into the U.S. anywhere around the world is just kind of non-existent right now. So when you were baby Dr. Ijeoma, did you know that you would be a blogger, a public health historian, and an entrepreneur?
Absolutely not. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a lot of different things, but the thing that I wanted to be for the longest time was a doctor. I wanted to be a pediatrician. I really wanted to like help kids be healthy. My mom was a nurse, so I kind of grew up with a parent in the healthcare system. You know, doctors were like the thing that smart people became. So for the longest time, I wanted to be a pediatrician.
And then when did that all change?
So when I got to college, I entered college thinking that I was going to major in pre-med. Actually, pre-med wasn't a major. I declared that I would be pre-med and take pre-med classes, and I was going to major in biology. But actually, the science classes just weren't that interesting. So I ended up majoring in history of science because it was the only non-science major that the courses also counted towards pre-med. So I was still fulfilling pre-med, but without having to be like an official science, a bio or chem major. And then while I kind of started taking courses in history of science, I was like, oh, this is like much more interesting than particles and atoms and molecules, like thinking about how scientific development has come about. There was one course I took on like the history of psychology, which I thought was fascinating, thinking about the history of medicine. So I just became much more interested in the like lived and social and cultural experience of how we experience health and disease, as opposed to like the molecular and anatomical manifestations of health and disease, which I think is what doctors deal with. I became much more interested in, one, public health, but also like why different diseases came to exist at different historical moments and why they affected different people for different reasons. So that's how I ended up steering away from medicine into public health, and more specifically into history of public health.
But still staying so close to it, because public health definitely dips and dabbles into medicine and things like that. There's an entanglement somewhere in there. So at what point did you decide that you would pursue graduate school, and what made you pursue specifically a master's in social medical sciences?
Maybe like start of the senior year. I was writing my undergraduate thesis, and I was writing about asthma. I basically started what would eventually become my dissertation. I started it in college. So I was writing on the history of asthma in Black Americans. And I kind of vaguely remember feeling like there was no way that I could research all of this in the 6 months time that I had to do my thesis. So at some point, someone encouraged me to continue researching it at the graduate level. So at that time, because I had just the year prior decided not to be pre-med, I was still kind of like unsure what I was doing with my life. So someone said that, okay, why don't you just try applying to PhD programs? I randomly just applied. I didn't have like this big dream to be like a professor or anything. I just wanted to continue doing the research on asthma that I had started, because no one had done it. There have been books on the history of asthma, but no one has talked about asthma in like the rise of asthma in Black people in America or even globally. So I just thought that it was an interesting topic that I wanted to continue researching. I actually applied only to programs that were MA to PhD programs. So PhD programs that would allow you to get your master's along the way, because I had done a summer program, and one of the pieces of advice that I will never forget, really stuck out to me, was that someone recommended, rather than spending money on a master's degree, if you can, just apply straight into the PhD program. And if you get in, then you just get a free master's. And if you don't want to do it anymore, just drop out. So I figured that I would shoot my shot first. And I applied to PhD programs that allowed you to get your master's along the way, and was fortunate enough to get into a few.
So did you always know that you would spend your academic career at the Ivy Leagues?
No, not at all. So when I was in high school, I went to a pretty bougie high school. I went to a private high school in New Jersey, pretty small. I think our graduating class was like 130 people. People were like really well off. It was like one of those schools where tuition is like the same as college. We were on scholarship. My brothers and I were on scholarship. It was not the life that we came from. But, my parents really worked hard to put us in spaces where we could further ourselves. My parents really prided and valued education, let me say that. So when I was applying to colleges, it wasn't important to me to go to an Ivy League. I actually wanted to go to school in New York. So I grew up maybe like an hour and a half outside of New York City. So to me, like New York was everything. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is where the cool kids are. So I wanted to go to Columbia for school. And I guess that is still an Ivy League, but I ended up going to Harvard for undergrad. And then I don't know, I think for me, when I applied to PhD programs, I didn't just apply to Ivies. I applied elsewhere, but I had always wanted to go to Columbia. I'd always wanted to live in New York. So that was like the dream come true. And there was another program that was pretty similar, and I think I would have gotten the same quality of interdisciplinary education that I got at Columbia. But the socio-medical sciences program is pretty unique in that it has a multidisciplinary approach to public health. That's something that I was interested in.
Okay. Did you face any challenges while in academia?
I did. So I went into my PhD program immediately after college. So graduated in May, started PhD in August. And when I started, there were 4 of us in my cohort, and I was naturally the youngest. And everyone else I think I started at 21, and everyone else was 27 or 28. So it was really difficult for me, I think, to relate to people. Like my cohort, they were all really nice. They were like all really nice women, but still, like I was fresh out of college. I was just a very different place then than I am now. So I found it difficult to relate to people. I really just felt like I didn't belong. Like those first 2 years, I really struggled with speaking up in classes, with feeling like I knew what I was doing. A lot of other people already had master's degrees. So I just felt really inadequately prepared, and I didn't really have the confidence to articulate myself, even ask questions when I didn't know what was going on. That was a big challenge. Another challenge that I faced was that because my department is interdisciplinary, there are some people who use qualitative methods and some people who use quantitative methods. and in public health, and I think this is probably across multiple disciplines, but specifically in public health, a lot of faculty salary is based off of grants. A huge chunk of faculty's income is based off of being able to secure grants. And so really early on in my program, I noticed that the faculty who were able to secure grants were faculty who worked with quantitative methods. And I knew that I was not interested in doing a quantitative study. That just wasn't something that I wanted to incorporate into my research. So I feel like I was really disillusioned very early on into feeling like qualitative methods, even archival research, historical research wasn't really valued in public health as much as quant studies, or another big thing that my department focused on was doing research on HIV. And so I felt like if you weren't researching HIV, there was no grant money, there was no faculty mentors who you could work with, because so many people seemed to be in that department at the time. So many people were working on HIV work. So I think those were two major challenges that I found during my program. Really just a lot of issues stemmed from me just being super young, naive, and not knowing what was going on. And the other bit was kind of feeling like my work wasn't valuable because I didn't even see evidence of faculty members who were doing some work being rewarded for that work.
Yeah, it sounds like imposter syndrome pretty much, where you just you just don't feel like, oh my God, I'm going to be figured out. They're going to find out I don't belong here. So let me just sit back and just pretend like I don't belong here, because you really don't feel like you belong.
Yeah. I took a leave of absence after my second year, withdrew from all of my courses. I think I was 6 weeks into the semester, and I was just like, hey guys, I can't. So I withdrew from all of my courses. I was doing hair out of my apartment for a couple of months. It was so random.
Really?
I just needed that break. Yeah, I was running a little salon. But right before that happened, I remember that there were two faculty members who, one was the anthropologist and one was a sociologist. And they had both been in the department as faculty for almost 30 years. And the department was really short on funding and decided not to renew these two faculty members' contracts. So in my mind, I was like, well, if they can't get a job, I'm sure we can't get a job. It was just a really a wake up call that I needed to figure out. And now that I think about it, this probably inspired me to pursue, or at least investigate non-academic options, because if you are working for 30 years at a school, for them to wake up one day and say that you haven't brought in enough grant money so you can no longer teach, it was just really disillusioning as a second year student. So I took a leave of absence. Luckily, I ended up getting a national fellowship. I got an NSF fellowship. So I feel like that was a sign from God that I was supposed to be there and I was supposed to continue in my program. Otherwise, I don't know if I could have finished after all that. It was a lot right there.
So you applied for the NSF grant, I'm assuming maybe the beginning of your second year, or... Yeah. Okay, so you apply for it, you take this leave of absence, and then during that time, you find out you received it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what gave you that desire to come back. But was it specifically seeing those faculty members leave that really made you feel like you couldn't do it? Or were there other personal things that were going on with you that you were like, I don't see myself in this field? I mean, you didn't technically, but were there some more personal things that held you back?
Right. So I think, one was my age. It's just I think a lot of 22-year-olds are pretty flighty. So we don't know what we want at 22. Our generation, we work a job for 6 months and we change our minds. So I think that was part of the issue. Another one was, this feeling as if the kind of work that I wanted to do wasn't going to be valued in my entire discipline, in my entire field, and that there weren't really opportunities, evidenced by the fact that senior faculty were fired, essentially. A third thing is that there were so few Black women in my department. There's so few Black female faculty in the school as a whole. There was no one who I could look to and feel like, oh, okay, well, because they're doing it, I can do it too. There was one Black female faculty in my department at the time, and there was one Puerto Rican female faculty. And so I had approached both of them, trying to build relationships. The Black woman, oh my gosh, it was one of the worst experiences of my life. She was just in retrospect, I realized that she was on her way out. She was over the program. She had already checked out and was like trying to go. Her advice was so unhelpful. It was so like beyond unhelpful. So I think I explained to her how I was interested in asthma, but like also sort of interested in like the natural hair movement as a health social movement, but also I'm from Africa. And so like maybe interested in like global and like African public health. And she took all of those three things and decided that there was some like random mosquito in the African continent that I should study the history of. And I was like, what? Like, what does that even mean? So that was that conversation. And then the conversation with the Puerto Rican faculty she's pretty young. So for her, I was kind of trying to find advice about how do I get past my age of impacting my imposter syndrome. And she did the complete other way. She was like, well, I started when I was 19. You know, you're fortunate that you're in New York City. Like I did my PhD at Cornell and there were no people of color whatsoever, like not in the school, not in the town. So like you have it way better than me. And so that's the approach that she took. So that was also a very unhelpful conversation. So I really lacked guidance and mentorship and encouragement in my program. All of those different challenges made it really difficult for me in the early years.
Yeah. And so now you're back and you get your grant, get this NSF grant, and it gives you that motivation to come back. What guided you, seeing that you didn't feel that you had that guidance, into your PhD research field?
So when I got the NSF, so that gave me the flexibility to not have to work for anyone. Previously, the funding that I had to be a research assistant. And so I was kind of like bouncing around to different people trying to find a good fit. No one was a good fit. With the NSF, I no longer had to work for someone. I didn't have to work at all. So one, it gave me the chance, the freedom to do things outside of school. And that's when I really started blogging heavily and started building my business. And just having something to do outside of school kind of lifted the weight off my shoulders and feeling like, okay, if I don't figure this out, like I'm doomed. So I kind of always had a backup plan. Like, okay, if the PhD doesn't work out, if I don't finish school, fine. Like I have something else I can be doing. And having the blog on the side definitely helped with that. Secondly, by my fourth year, a new faculty member came in who was a younger guy who had actually gone through, not the program, but my former advisor, who was like an old white guy who was also kind of just like so senior in the field that he's very well known, very well respected, but isn't exactly like the hands-on mentoring kind, which is what I needed. So this junior faculty member came in and he was a recent PhD graduate. So he just kind of got it. He understood. And so I was able to connect with him and he was able to give me like the hands-on line by line reading and guidance that I needed. The NSF came at the right time. And then this new faculty member came in and he ended up being my dissertation sponsor, getting me through the program.
Okay. And for those who don't know, I'm talking about me. Can you explain the difference between having a PhD advisor and a sponsor? Because this is actually my first time hearing about the term like sponsor.
This probably is program specific. Like in your first year, you're assigned an academic advisor. The school just assigns you a faculty member who is supposed to guide you, right? But you may or may not click with that person. At least how my department did it is that your sponsor is the person who does the closest reading of your dissertation. We also had a dissertation chair, but this is where it got confusing because there's a chair and then a sponsor. The chair was usually like the most senior person who was kind of just did the administrative stuff, but the sponsor was the person who was doing like the closest advising. So it turned out that the person who had been assigned as my advisor when I came into the program, that older faculty member, he ended up being my chair. But then the person who was the younger faculty member who was able to give me more hands-on mentoring, he was my sponsor.
Okay, got it. What was the funding project that you proposed to NSF? And how did that lead into like the research that you actually ended up doing?
I've been doing the same project since I was in college. I didn't even take the time to explore anything else. I just wanted to keep on writing about the history of asthma. That's what I applied to the NSF to research was understanding the intellectual and environmental history of asthma or its relationship with race, especially in urban environments, what I ended up ultimately writing my dissertation on.
You talk a little bit on your blog, your research and things, and I was like, oh my goodness, I really think people need to know this because you have dug up so much information and it's just sitting there sometimes if we aren't reapproaching this information and just spreading the knowledge. Moving forward, I just kind of want to learn some of the things that you address in the public health field. One thing I want to start off with is there was this idea that only white people had asthma and were impacted by asthma. Why was that a thing? Why did people believe that only white people had asthma?
Yeah, and isn't that such a crazy question? And this is probably the guiding question for my entire dissertation. Now we think it's so ridiculous. In the late 19th century, so in the 1800s, asthma, like the technical definition is wheezing, shortness of breath. The first people in American medical literature to have asthma were doctors, were some writers. And so like the class of people who is a doctor or who is like a writer is the elite. So doctors believed that they had asthma because of their, one, elite status, two, because of their like intellectual stress, if you will, and three, because a lot of them lived in an urban area. So lived in New York, lived in Boston, etc. And so asthma was conceptualized early on as not an allergy as we think of it now, or not a respiratory condition, but it was thought to be a nervous condition, like a function of your brain being so stressed and your life being so difficult because you live such an elite, cultivated life that you sometimes had trouble breathing. So that's what doctors thought back in the day.
So they used to think that asthma was like anxiety.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the reasons I became so fascinated with the history of medicine as opposed to medicine in itself is because, you know, we really think about medicine and science as objective. Like now we're like, okay, you know, even if you think about how doctors and researchers are approaching coronavirus, what they know are facts. But history has shown us that what doctors know is subject to change. Like medical definitions change all the time. Ideas about how diseases work and how they manifest in the body, those change over time as different technological and scientific developments occur. So yeah, in the mid 1800s, like people were believing a whole lot of random stuff about various diseases. But yeah, asthma was thought to be a nervous condition, essentially.
Okay. So at what point did they realize like other people have asthma that weren't white doctors?
Yeah. So the first cases recorded in American medical literature of Black people with asthma was in the late 1800s. So the first recorded medical cases were like in the early 1800s. By like 1890, there was one specific case of a doctor in Maryland who had reported that a colored man had come to his clinic with symptoms of asthma, with wheezing and shortness of breath. What was really funny about that case is that other medical scholars at that time debated about whether this person, like this specific case, whether it was actually asthma or whether it was something else. So Black people have had asthma, like from jump, but because doctors had, you know, decided that asthma was, or believed at the time that asthma was an elite affliction, in their minds it was just impossible for Black people to have it. You know, similarly, you just talked about anxiety. Things like fainting spells, that notion of like fainting or being anxious, that used to be a very female thing or an only female thing. So if a man fainted, he wasn't having hot flashes. Like, oh, if a woman fainted, it would just be like, okay, well, she's a woman, so she's fainting, she's frail. But if a man fainted, there would be some other reason. So that was the same way that doctors thought about asthma back then. So if someone was wheezing, if they were white and if they were elite, okay, fine, they had asthma. But if they were Black, this doesn't really make sense. It has to be something else. I've always found it interesting how doctors have, over time, understood disease in the context of their social era, in the context of what's happening in their lives around them.
And how was that transition from, okay, only white doctors have asthma to, okay, now we understand that Black people have it and it's showing up in these medical journals?
So it took about 60 years. So from the first case, which is like 1890s, medical literature did not talk about asthma in Black people again until the 1950s. So for all of the first half of the 20th century, nobody was really thinking about asthma in Black people. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, medicine was very segregated after emancipation. So a lot of doctors, even in the North, a lot of white doctors treated white patients, and Black doctors who at that time, there were starting to be a growing number of Black doctors because there were a couple of historically Black medical schools in the early 1900s. So Black doctors treated Black people and white doctors treated white people. They did not share the same journals, so there wasn't any crosstalk. So it really wasn't until hospitals were integrated in the 50s and the 60s that doctors started to now, again, interact with Black patients on a regular and large scale basis and started to realize from case studies and just anecdotal evidence that, oh, wow, there are actually a number of Black people in certain communities that are all complaining from asthma.
So at the time, were the Black doctors acknowledging that Black people had asthma, or was it still like an unknown thing?
Black doctors were acknowledging it. So as early as like the 1930s, 1940s, you see this a lot in Black newspapers. There were only a handful of Black medical journals back then, but in Black newspapers, that's really where there were doctors' columns. So that's really where they would share their expertise with the community. And Black doctors were talking about asthma in Black communities. So it definitely existed. It's just that, white doctors weren't talking about it.
Okay, got it. What was it like being Black with asthma during the civil rights movement?
There's one letter to one of these medical doctors that I remember reading, and one woman had written in and asked the doctor for help because her daughter, I think her daughter was 6 or so. They live in a basement apartment. Their landlord was trash, was not updating the apartment. There was mold. It was cold and damp. And their daughter was suffering from asthma attacks. So the woman had written into the newspaper asking the doctor what they could do. So at that time, people are dealing with racism overtly. They're dealing with economic insecurity. They're dealing with police brutality. They're dealing with housing insecurity. There was a fear of the woman not feeling like she could confront her landlord because her landlord was likely not Black. Her options were to either stay and have her daughter's asthma continue or to try and find somewhere else to live, which would have been really difficult during that time. So the prospects were not great during the civil rights movement. Think about asthma and the ability to breathe and how that is so tied up into outdoor air quality. It's tied up into housing. It's tied up into just general economic security and socioeconomic status, that I think suffering of asthma is very emblematic of more general civil rights issues and civil rights tensions. One interesting thing, though, is that at one point, closer to the 70s, the beginning of the 70s, there was a New York Times article written saying that asthma was caused by the civil rights movement. And that Black people protesting and their anger towards white people was manifesting their inability to breathe and was contributing to asthma. So I always thought that was kind of a really interesting take on the problem of asthma in Black communities during the civil rights movement.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that tidbit. I'm just over here oh, my goodness. And every time I just thought it wasn't going to get any wilder, I'm like, oh, my goodness.
It's a crazy story. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I chose to study asthma as opposed to another disease is because even today, asthma impacts people differently. There's some people who, their asthma is triggered by an allergy to dust or pets. There's some people who have exercise-induced asthma. It's not very well understood. The mechanisms are well understood, but the manifestations happen differently in different people. So I think that diseases like that don't have a clear basis, they're very much subject to their interpretation. So, depending on what year it is, how people are feeling, the different explanations that have come up over the past 100 years to understand asthma have been really, really, really interesting. And alongside with that, a lot of the different treatment options that have been recommended to people have been interesting.
So let's jump to today, okay? So how prevalent is asthma in the Black community, and how does that compare to other racial groups?
Black people are more likely to have asthma on average than whites and Asians and most Hispanic groups. There's this one specific Hispanic group that actually has higher rates of asthma than Black Americans, which are Puerto Ricans, which I've always found pretty interesting. But other Hispanic groups have lower asthma rates. But it's Black people and Puerto Ricans are most likely to have asthma in comparison to other racial groups. I don't know the exact numbers, though.
Okay, so how likely are people to die from asthma?
I think today, with proper management, with proper medication, with a good relationship to a primary care doctor, asthma is actually pretty manageable. Most people don't die from it. Most people live completely full lives. I think when people tend to die from asthma attacks is either when they don't have inhalers handy, when they're not regularly managing their asthma with a doctor. So if you have an asthma attack, you don't have an inhaler, so then you go to the emergency room. But if you're too late, that's usually when people die. But if you go to the doctor regularly, if you have access to inhalers or other corticosteroids, then most people are able to live with asthma.
Okay. And you spoke a little on this before, but I want to just outline it. What are some factors that contribute to asthma?
Asthma, it's really interesting because there are many, many different factors that contribute to asthma. So let me start with inside the home. I tend to think about asthma, risk factors, as indoor and outdoor. So indoor risk factors, inside the home, you can have mold, you can have dust, dander, anything that can cause an allergic reaction. Those things can contribute to asthma. Outside the home, poor air quality, a lot of air pollution, living in a place where there are a lot of buses or a place where there are a lot of garbage dumps. And then other social factors, risk factors, such as being Black or Puerto Rican, living in an urban environment versus a rural environment. Those things also increase your risk factors that can contribute to asthma.
Living in an urban area would cause it so that you're more likely to be impacted by asthma?
Because of air pollution.
Okay.
So I think there have been mixed studies. Most studies show that urban residents is a risk factor for asthma compared to rural residents. But then there have been some studies that show in some rural areas, if there are, if it's very rural, if they're cooking over open flames a lot, then that smoke inhalation can now contribute to asthma. Also because it's not just the air itself, but oftentimes living in an urban area comes with other covariates, usually a minority, usually are below a certain socioeconomic status. And so all of those tie in together to contribute to asthma.
Okay. Is there any research or anything that you're familiar with that speaks on ways of coping with asthma and improving symptoms?
Right. So actually, a lot of the recommendations today they're similar to the ones from 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, when people thought that asthma was a nervous condition, the solution was to remove yourself from the stressful environment that you were in. So if they lived in New York, they would go to Arizona or Denver, to these open air facilities, and basically go on holiday for a couple of weeks and then be cured of asthma. So now what people are recommended to do, if you're living in a home that is moldy, your doctor would recommend that you move to another apartment that doesn't have mold. If you have pet-induced asthma and there's a pet in the house, you remove the pet from the house. So it's really about changing your environment. Those are a lot of the non-medical recommendations, just changing your environment to address the triggers, the allergens that trigger your asthma. But most asthmatics have inhalers that they use either daily or as needed if they're having an asthma attack. So that's the medical coping mechanism. It's just daily treatment and daily maintenance. Otherwise, your other option is to change your environment some kind of way.
So one thing I really love to do on the podcast is to motivate or inspire people to go into research and think on topics that they may be interested in. So are there any topics related to asthma that you wish were better researched?
Actually, yes. I think in relation to your last question, something that has been interesting me is that because Black people have had asthma for so long and the white medical field ignored it for so long, I'm sure that there are some culturally Black or passed down traditions, kind of holistic approaches to treating asthma or to managing asthma that I haven't really seen in the medical literature, but I think would be really interesting. What is the cultural history of holistic approaches to asthma in the Black community? I feel that is a great study that someone else should conduct.
I love the emphasis on that someone else part. I love it. I like to inspire others to do things that I personally won't do.
Yes. Yeah. So that's definitely one of the things that I think is really interesting because I think in public health research in general, but especially in history of public health, there's so much focus on what doctors thought and what researchers thought. But people are also knowledge producers too. People take care of their own health. People manage their own health, like without the help of doctors. So it'd be really interesting to know what people were doing on their own, like without the help of doctors to manage their asthma.
Yeah. So can you give 3 tips for someone who wants to pursue the history of public health?
Yes. So tip number 1 for pursuing history of public health is identifying a time period that you're interested in. So there are some people who study 20th century history. There are some people who study antebellum, like pre-Civil War history. But figuring out first like what time period you want to study will be really helpful, because there are some diseases that no longer exist now. So that would be my first tip. Just identify what time period that you're interested in. Tip number 2 would be to figure out a disease or a consumer idea of health. So whether that's health insurance or health policy or health activism, you don't need to necessarily study a specific disease, but you need to study some aspect of health. So either figure out whether you're more interested in understanding a specific disease, a health institution, a product, or fabric of health. Once you know the time period that you're interested in, and then you know the topic that you're interested in, you are 90% there of the way to finding a research topic. And then the third tip that I have is to really be critical of how your own contemporary understanding of the world informs your research. So what that means is if you're studying something 100 years ago, be open to the fact that the interesting and weird, sometimes what you might think are completely ludicrous ways of thinking and ideas that doctors or researchers or the public had hundreds of years ago about health, in that time, in that era, they made perfect sense. So try to detach yourself and detach your contemporary knowledge of health and disease from the topic and the time period that you're studying from. Try to remain an objective storyteller and narrator, and don't ascribe your current understandings of health and medicine onto the past.
That was beautiful. Great. I loved it. So one more question. I'm going to say a word, and I want you to tell me the first word that comes to your head. Happy.
Ooh, my son. I'm so cheesy. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to connect with Dr. Ijeoma Kola, she is at Ijeoma Kola on Instagram. Also, you can go to www.ijeomakola.com. All of that will be in the show notes. If you want to connect with me, I am at The Research Her on all of the socials. You can always reach me at theresearchher.com. And until next time, I holla.